Well, I've been doing a lot of election stuff lately. Haven't been focusing as much on foreign policy, which, is a bad thing. I should be spending more time following the wars and such. But in the last month, now that we have until the election, I do think that it is relevant to talk about these topics. And something that I've been noticing since I have been, watching the polls more closely now since we are in the last month, and I'm someone who tends to watch polls every election. I'm used to the numbers that we see, and I'm familiar with with how wrong polls have been in the past. With that said, though, I still do find generally in the past I've regarded the polls to be a useful tool. I don't think that they've ever been exact, but you use averages, it'll generally tell you one way or the other what the direction is. Yes, I've always thought that polls tend to bias in favor of Democrats, but the question is, is it really by a significant enough margin to where you can just throw out all the polls and say they don't matter? And in the past, I would have said no. It's still useful to look at the polls. But the last few years, they seem to be getting worse. And in hindsight, looking back at 2016, and especially something that I noticed at the time, 2018, polls in certain states are just they don't seem reliable at all. And so I've been trying to delve more into this issue and try and learn more about the technicals aspects of polling and such. And so I've been watching a lot of People's Pundit and trying to study how the methodology works for polling and such. And I won't get into the details about that side of things because there are plenty of people who are educated in this sort of thing who are professional pollsters. I think I got cut off there for a second, but anyway, I was just saying, if you want to learn about how polls work and such, don't come to me. That's not my wheelhouse. My goal is not to be a polling expert. I just kind of delved into it for a couple of days to try and see if I could challenge my perspective on polls, and I think I did. And I've come away with a different understanding, and it's now meshing with other things that I've been talking about, namely the potential for unrest after the coming election. I've said that if Donald Trump wins, it's pretty clear things are going to get rough. I'm by no means the only person who has said that. Lots of people are saying that, and for good reason. And it's not surprising that there would be crazy people who are riled up into a frenzy who go out and riot. I don't think that's such a crazy thing to think about. But how do you get ordinary people, the kinds of folks who aren't out rioting, to sympathize with the rioters? Because you see, back in the spring and the summer, when we had all of these Black Lives Matter riots, there was certainly an effort by the media to justify the riots and to obfuscate and to equivocate, to try and make it seem like it's okay what these people are doing, even if you're, a nice, friendly American who doesn't want to smash anybody's windows. You can at least relate to these folks. And the people smashing windows, they don't really mean it. They're not bad people. They're fighting against injustice, and this is their way of doing it. So you have to respect the diversity of tactics. That's what we hear. But it would be a little harder, I think, right now to justify violence after the election if there are the similar kinds of riots in the streets after, say, a narrow Trump victory, something that the Transition Integrity Project, a Democrat and also never Trump, funded and organized effort, they came to that conclusion that that's what they think is going to happen, which I think is a fair and reasonable assumption, that there would be unrest after a narrow Trump victory. But, such violence might scare a lot of ordinary people, and they might think, what, I don't like Trump, but if he won, he won. So how would they get people on the side of the rioters? Obviously, there's no dead black people when it comes to, an election night result to sort of, wave a bloody shirt over. They can't exactly go to these people and say, well, they're fighting against racial injustice or something like that. I mean, they could, but I don't think it would be a very compelling argument. I think it would be a little bit of a roundabout way of connecting Donald Trump's victory to racial injustice. So what's a really strong thing? What's a really strong case you can make to justify significant unrest, the kinds of unrest we've seen this year in the wake of the election? And I would say if it's very clear that Donald Trump rigged the election in his favor and that he cheated to win and that he is truly an illegitimate president and that a democracy in America is in shambles. Because at that point, if our elections lose legitimacy, if our elections are no longer a way of correcting and voting out politicians who we don't like as Americans, well, then I think that a lot of Americans on both sides of the aisle could justify rising up, sometimes violently, against the system to try and overthrow that illegitimate actor. And that brings me back to the polls. The polls are our dead unarmed black men in the streets killed by cops, if that makes sense. The polls are sort of the evidence of injustice. By themselves, there's nothing wrong with them, but if you apply a certain bias to them and a certain understanding, it can seem like something very evil that you have to rise up against. I.e., if the polls are radically different from the results we see on Election Day. For example, if we showed that Biden was winning, 52%, Trump 48% in the polls, and then all of a sudden on Election Day, Trump wins 99% of the vote, people would go, oh my gosh, this is rigged. But likewise, if the polls are saying that Joe Biden is up 10% in the polls, and in many states like Florida has a double-digit lead, something which is just politically impossible in this state. Nobody wins Florida by double digits. It doesn't happen. In fact, they said the same thing about Andrew Gillum. I remember very clearly in the 2018 campaign. I was involved in that campaign. Gillum was supposedly up double digits. And if not double digits, high single digits. Of course, it ended up coming down to within 1%, the final results. And they tried to do a recount, and he still lost. He refused to concede the race. And I think it's an pretty easy case to make if you start from the position of, the polls are generally accurate. If you see that the final election results not only don't go in your favor, but are radically different from what all the polls were suggesting, I think it's easy to make the case to a lot of ordinary Americans who oppose Donald Trump that he rigged it in his favor. And so all of these polls that I'm seeing coming out, and the stuff this week about Florida, anyone, Biden or anybody, having a double-digit lead in Florida, totally preposterous. And when I see stuff like that, that just looks like, pure propaganda. I have no idea how anyone would even, put those numbers out. But of course, I look at it and I think, well, if the polls are this wrong, obviously in Florida, in a state that I understand, how wrong are they everywhere else? How different might the results be on Election Day versus the polls? And if Trump ends up eking out an electoral college victory, losing the popular vote because he outperformed the polls significantly in just a few states that he had to win, how hard will it be for certain people to make the case that he just rigged it in his favor and that we need to go out and riot now, and that even if you're not rioting, the rioting is justified. And it's not rioting, it's peaceful protesting. People have been trained in this all year. I mean, all the ingredients are here, they've been mixed in the bowl, and, frankly, they've been scooped out into little dough balls and put on the cookie sheet. Now it's just time to pop them in the oven. And on November 4th, the day after the election, you just pull those cookies out of the oven, and you've got a perfectly primed revolution on your hands. If I did not look closer into these numbers, because I saw how wrong they are here in Florida, which 99% of Americans who are looking at the polls aren't going to look any deeper than that. And even Americans who aren't watching the polls afterwards, if they hear all the polls for the whole time, showed Biden up so much, and then he lost narrowly, it will be very, very easy to make that case. Trump has been pretty thoroughly delegitimized amongst the Democratic base for some time now over the various different scandals like the Russia Gate and the Ukraine Gate and whatever else they're talking about these days. such as him being sick, that apparently means that he should be overthrown too by the 25th Amendment. I think that accusing him of rigging the election when they've already been floating all these trial balloon stories before. Remember about the post office, removing the mailboxes, that weird conspiracy theory. These things are all priming people for this stuff on the day after the election. And I think the polls will be a big part of that. That is the most that's the most stark thing that you can point to. Not necessarily as proof that the election was rigged. They're going to come up with other ideas behind that, such as the post office stuff, or voter suppression, or getting people off the rolls, or throwing out mail-in ballots, which again is going to happen. Because remember what I talked about, how the attrition rate when it comes to mail-in ballots in a lot of these states, people don't fill them out correctly, the ballot gets thrown out. A large percentage of ballots could be thrown out. And then all of these will be cited as evidence, and the polls will illustrate just how much Biden was winning before Trump rigged everything in his favor. That, I think, will be a big part of the case, because look at it. Biden up 10 points nationally, up double digits in Florida, up double digits in a bunch of other states. If Trump comes back and wins these places by 1%, which I think very possible right now, that Trump wins Florida by about the same margin that he won last time, because Florida's always pretty much 50-50. It's always close here. People can talk about how the polls fluctuate one way or the other over the whole course of the election, but on election day, it always comes down to 1 or 2% for whoever's going to win. So Florida always can go either way. So I think that it's a pretty good shot. Trump holds on here. He's definitely going to win Ohio and Iowa. If he doesn't win Ohio and Iowa, that would just be absurd as well. And it would be a very, very bad night for him. It would be, he would basically lose probably 40 states if he doesn't win Ohio and Iowa. So to me, what seems like a very reasonable assumption is that, Trump, holds on to Florida, holds on to Arizona, and holds on to Pennsylvania. That plus all the other red states would add up to enough for him to just barely make it over the Electoral College hump. And so that's assuming he loses Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Something that, again, I think is quite likely. Could he still win those? Of course. He won them last time and nobody thought he was. And the polls, again, last time did not show him winning those states, but those states were underpolled. But considering that those states were never heavily polled anyway in the past, do the pollsters really know how to try and poll them now? No, probably not. So I don't know how accurate the polling is there, but let's just say that it's accurate and that it's only wrong in these other states, in these states that are that I think I'm pretty sure are close. So that was my epiphany today. I'm sure I'm not the first person who has said this, but to me this is a very big deal. I think that the polls are certainly conditioning the population to believe that Donald Trump is going to lose and that Joe Biden is going to win in a landslide. That's what the polls are saying. The polls show Biden winning or being competitive in every state that isn't deep red. I mean, there are even people who are trying to say that Biden could win Texas. Now, I don't think that most of America will be surprised when Biden loses Texas, but if he wins Texas, I don't think that the average American would be shocked at this point. And that is, of course, based on media coverage and polling. It's just simply not realistic to think that Joe Biden has a shot in Texas or in Georgia. But the fact of the matter is that for people who are not, hardcore Trump supporters right now, the idea that Biden wins Georgia or Texas is more believable than the idea that Trump wins another term. And so people are conditioned to believe that Joe Biden is definitely going to win and is going to win handily, and then he loses. People are naturally going to be very skeptical of those results. And this reminds me of the strategy that you see in these various countries where they try and have their little color revolutions to overthrow a leader they don't like. What does the opposition do when it comes to election time? Do they go out and vote really hard to try and get their guy elected? to beat the dictator, or the supposed dictator. No, what they do is they boycott the elections. They tell all their supporters, stay home, don't vote, because these elections are not legitimate. And then what happens is only the supporters of the incumbent president go out and vote, and then he ends up with like 80 or 90% of the vote. Go figure. The opposition decided to boycott the election, so he won with 80 or 90%. And then what happens after that election? After the election that the opposition boycotted, the opposition comes out and says, look, he won 80 or 90% of the vote. That's totally rigged. We know. Look, we're here. We're very loud opposition. Look at how many of us there are. And they're saying that he won 80 or 90% of the vote. That man obviously rigged the election. And the strategy here is that, that they start saying that the election is going to be rigged before the election even occurs. And so we see that here in a more subtle way, I think, with the polls, because the polls, what they're doing is they're showing, okay, if we have a fair election, Joe Biden wins in a landslide. And so therefore, the implication is if Trump wins, it has to be rigged. It's the same thing they do in these other countries before they push for riots to overthrow people like, what was his name, in Bolivia that just got overthrown. A left-wing guy, by the way, overthrown by the CIA. Before, in all these other countries in Eastern Europe, Georgia, Ukraine, Milosevic in Yugoslavia, they discredit the election before it occurs, and they make it a lose-lose. So either, somehow the opposition candidate who's not expected to win wins, and then they don't say the election was rigged, or the incumbent wins and they say it was definitely rigged. They make it a certainty that if the person that we don't support wins, the election has to, by definition, be rigged. And another example of this is when they come out and they always ask Trump, oh my gosh, are you going to accept the results of the election? I mean, when you lose, because that's a foregone conclusion, are you going to step down, or are you going to try and sit there and the generals are going to have to overthrow you, in some kind of coup? Oh my gosh, these people, they're wetting their beds over it in glee. This is just another way of conditioning the public to understand that, yes, Donald Trump is going to lose. And he may very well lose. I think that's certainly possible. I'm not the most bullish person on Trump, but I have to keep an open mind, because I know for a fact now that at least in Florida, polls are totally off. They're not realistic. It reminds me again a lot of 2018, where the polls over and over said Gillum was going to win. And something I found very compelling was that People's Pundit went over this race on his show this week. And that is a race that I'm very familiar with at the time. I followed it very closely because, of course, I live in Florida. We've never had a progressive Democrat as governor. The only Democrats we ever elected here were Dixiecrats. We've never elected a modern, even liberal Democrat. Lawton Chiles was not a liberal. The most, the furthest left governor we've ever had probably was Charlie Crist, and he was a Republican, at least at the time. And so it was very scary and disheartening to see Gillum ahead so many points in the polls, to see him with high single-digit leads, or again, in many polls, double-digit leads in this state, and then he ends up losing. Now, I don't want people to think that I'm being a negative Nancy or anything like that. I'm not necessarily shaking in my boots or quaking in my boots, whatever the expression is, over the thought of civil unrest because, if Trump wins re-election. In fact, that's kind of why I want Trump to win re-election, because I think it will further cement the break in our politics, because I think in this country we are beyond reconciliation. Our government is far too centralized for people who, for 320 million people to coexist. We can't all share, the same set of laws. This country is very diverse, as I've gone over many times, and I don't mean racially diverse. I mean diverse in terms of, culturally. It's very different parts of this country. And we need governments which are closer to the people. You can't just rule the whole thing from Washington. I do not believe that the right at all will be the ones to push us in that direction. The right, by nature, are conservative. They try and preserve things. They don't want radical changes. The people who are going to pursue the kinds of radical changes that are unfortunately necessary for social cohesion to once again reign in the in what is currently the United States, is we need a breakup, and that's going to have to come from the left. And I think that it is possible that that them feeling so disenfranchised after this election, after Trump wins, which I think, again, is very possible, that might be the catalyst we need to usher in a new era of decentralization in the United States, where people are fighting for their independence from Washington, whether that mean literally or just in terms of stripping away powers from the federal government. So with that said, if you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.